Every aviation documentary celebrates the P-38 Lightning as America's fork-tailed devil that dominated Pacific skies. But declassified documents and pilot testimonies reveal a darker story. This revolutionary fighter nearly killed the program before it ever reached combat. Test pilots died in mysterious high-speed dives nobody understood. The cockpit became a death trap in different ways at different altitudes. Enemy pilots had wildly different opinions about facing it depending on which front they flew. The Lightning's reputation was earned through blood, engineering failures, and desperate last-minute fixes. These aren't the sanitized facts from textbooks. This is what really happened. P-38 test pilots faced a terrifying mystery: high-speed dives that turned fatal without warning. When diving past 500 miles per hour, controls would suddenly lock solid, trapping pilots in uncontrollable descents. The aircraft was experiencing compressibility, transonic shock waves forming over control surfaces. But in 1941, aerodynamic theory couldn't explain it. Test pilot Ralph Verdon died during a high-speed dive test in November 1941 when his P-38 became uncontrollable. Engineers desperately tried different tail configurations and control modifications while more pilots risked their lives. The solution came through trial and error: dive recovery flaps that disrupted airflow enough to restore control authority. But pilots kept dying before anyone understood they were encountering the edge of supersonic flight in a subsonic aircraft. The P-38's environmental control system created a deadly temperature paradox. At high altitude over Europe, cockpit temperatures plummeted to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, freezing instruments and incapacitating pilots. The heating system used engine exhaust ducted into the cockpit, but at low altitude in the Pacific, this same system created temperatures exceeding 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Pilots reported passing out from heat exhaustion during tropical missions. Some illegally removed canopy panels to avoid heat stroke, sacrificing the pressurization that made high-altitude flight possible. Squadron commanders faced an impossible choice: watch pilots freeze in Europe or roast in the Pacific. Field modifications tried to regulate temperature, but the fundamental design flaw plagued the Lightning throughout the war. The P-38's Allison V-1710 engines became notorious for catastrophic failures during early operations. Pilots nicknamed them time bombs because cylinder heads would crack without warning, spraying boiling coolant into the engine nacelles. The problem stemmed from inadequate cooling in the P-38's unique installation. The engines sat buried in the booms with restricted airflow. Connecting rods failed during high-power climbs, and engine fires became disturbingly common. During early Pacific deployment, mechanical failures destroyed more P-38s than enemy action. The 475th Fighter Group documented engine-related losses at twice the rate of combat casualties during their first 3 months. Lockheed engineers worked frantically on cooling modifications, but pilots kept flying with power plants they didn't trust, and these engine problems pale compared to what happened when pilots tried to bail out. Abandoning a damaged P-38 was more dangerous than staying with the aircraft. The twin booms and horizontal stabilizer created a lethal obstacle directly behind the cockpit. Pilots attempting to bail out faced a horrifying risk: jumping into the tail structure at high speed. Multiple pilots were killed or severely injured hitting the tail during bailouts. Some were cut in half by the horizontal stabilizer. Others had their parachutes shredded by the twin booms. Fighter Command documented at least 17 fatal bailout accidents where pilots successfully escaped the cockpit but died hitting the airframe. Desperate engineers experimented with downward ejecting seats, but the solution never materialized during wartime. Pilots joked grimly that the P-38 wanted to kill you even after you left. Captured Luftwaffe pilots shocked American interrogators with their P-38 assessments. In systematic post-war interviews, German aces consistently ranked the Lightning as the least dangerous American fighter they encountered. They feared the P-47's ruggedness and the P-51's performance far more. The reason? At the altitudes where European combat occurred, the P-38's turbocharged engines underperformed compared to its reputation. German pilots noted that Lightnings were easy to see coming from great distance due to the distinctive silhouette and reluctant to engage in turning combat. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff called it impressive looking but not particularly worrying. These assessments remained classified for years because they contradicted the Lightning's carefully cultivated public image. But in the Pacific, Japanese pilots had a completely different experience. The P-38 required 3 times the maintenance hours of single-engine fighters. Each aircraft had 2 engines, 2 turbo superchargers, 2 cooling systems, and counter-rotating propellers, all requiring specialized maintenance. Pacific theater mechanics worked in brutal heat and humidity with inadequate tools and spare parts. A single mission could generate 20-plus maintenance discrepancies. The 8th Air Force calculated that keeping one P-38 mission ready required 150 man-hours weekly compared to 50 hours for a P-51. Squadrons often had half their Lightnings grounded awaiting parts or repairs. Ground crews worked 16-hour shifts trying to maintain combat readiness. Maintenance officers pleaded for simpler aircraft, but the Lightning's unique capabilities meant it couldn't be replaced, despite the logistical nightmare it created. The P-38's concentrated nose armament, one 20mm cannon and 4.50 caliber machine guns, seemed brilliant until pilots discovered a terrifying flaw. During certain power settings and airspeeds, gun blast interference created harmonic vibrations that could shatter propeller blades. Several P-38s literally shot their own propellers off during combat. The issue stemmed from muzzle blast disrupting airflow over the props at specific RPM ranges. Armament officers issued emergency directives about forbidden firing zones at certain speed and power combinations, but in combat, pilots couldn't always avoid them. Some Lightnings returned from missions with propeller blades cracked or missing chunks, mystifying mechanics until gun camera footage revealed pilots were destroying their own aircraft while shooting at the enemy. The P-38M night fighter variant remained so classified that most Lightning pilots never knew it existed. Lockheed converted 75 P-38Ls by adding radar pods under the nose and a second seat for a radar operator. These black-painted night fighters hunted Japanese aircraft over the Pacific during the war's final months. The radar operator sat behind and slightly below the pilot in a cramped added cockpit section. These aircraft scored numerous nocturnal kills, but their existence was suppressed to protect radar technology secrets. Even decades after the war, the P-38M remained obscure. Aviation museums today have only 4 surviving examples, and their combat records weren't declassified until the 1970s. The P-38's counter-rotating propellers eliminated torque roll but created bizarre new hazards. If one engine failed, the asymmetric thrust was manageable. But if one engine lost power partially, the unequal propeller drag created uncontrollable yaw. Pilots described it as the aircraft trying to swap ends. Emergency procedures required immediately shutting down and feathering any engine showing power loss. But this took precious seconds pilots often didn't have at low altitude. The props also created conflicting slipstream effects over the tail that made stall characteristics unpredictable. During training, 23 P-38s were lost to asymmetric thrust accidents before adequate emergency procedures were developed and drilled into pilots through repetition until it became instinct. The F-4 and F-5 photo reconnaissance Lightnings carried cameras instead of guns, making them completely defenseless. These pilots flew deep into enemy territory, alone, unarmed, and relying solely on speed to survive. They photographed targets before bombing raids, flying straight and level at specific altitudes for camera runs, while enemy fighters climbed to intercept them. Photo pilots had the highest casualty rates of any Lightning variant. They couldn't fight back, couldn't break formation to evade, and flew the most dangerous missions with zero offensive capability. Their only defense was hoping they could outrun attackers to friendly territory. These men were effectively flying intelligence-gathering coffins, yet their photographs enabled countless successful bombing missions that shortened the war. But even successful pilots faced something nobody anticipated. The P-38's twin engines created a unique acoustic nightmare. The counter-rotating props generated overlapping sound frequencies that produced destructive interference patterns directly at the pilot's head. Prolonged exposure caused severe hearing loss that wasn't recognized as service-connected until decades later. The cockpit's position between two massive Allison engines amplified noise to damaging levels. Measurements showed sustained 120-plus decibels during normal flight. Pilots returned from missions with ringing ears that never stopped. Many P-38 veterans developed profound deafness by their 30s. The military provided no hearing protection beyond leather helmets that did nothing against low-frequency engine noise. Thousands of Lightning pilots suffered permanent auditory damage that wasn't acknowledged or compensated until the 1980s. The P-38 consumed fuel at alarming rates that constantly threatened mission success. Each engine burned 100 gallons per hour at cruise power, double a single-engine fighter's consumption. On maximum range missions, pilots flew fuel-critical profiles where running one engine slightly too rich meant ditching in the ocean. Ferry flights became endurance nightmares requiring external drop tanks and perfect fuel management. Pacific missions were planned around fuel availability rather than tactical objectives. Pilots obsessively monitored fuel gauges, knowing miscalculations meant death. The 475th Fighter Group lost 14 P-38s to fuel exhaustion in 6 months, not from combat damage, but from simply running dry before reaching base. Every mission became a fuel calculation gamble. At high altitude over Europe, the P-38's nose-mounted guns would freeze completely inoperable. The concentrated armament that seemed so advantageous became useless when temperatures dropped below -30 degrees Fahrenheit. Gun oil congealed, firing mechanisms froze, and ammunition feed systems jammed solid. Pilots would line up perfect shots only to have all weapons fail simultaneously. They'd return from missions having never fired a round despite multiple enemy encounters. Armament crews tried different lubricants, heating systems, and even alcohol-based solutions, but nothing worked reliably. Some squadrons reported 60% gun failure rates during winter missions. German pilots learned to exploit this, drawing P-38s into high-altitude combat where they knew American guns would freeze, turning deadly fighters into helpless targets. The P-38's modern Tricycle landing gear proved structurally inadequate for combat operations. The nose gear collapsed during hard landings with disturbing frequency, sending aircraft skidding down runways on their bellies. Pacific Island strips with rough coral surfaces were especially deadly. Gear failures damaged 89 P-38s beyond repair in one 6-month period. The nose strut wasn't designed for the punishment of carrier-style arrested landings that rough field operations required. Pilots developed elaborate soft landing techniques, but combat damage often made gentle touchdowns impossible. Maintenance crews reinforced gear struts with field modifications that weren't officially approved. Aircraft would survive enemy fire only to be destroyed by landing gear failure returning to base. The P-38's maintenance complexity spawned a massive black market in spare parts. Desperate mechanics traded, stole, and fabricated components to keep aircraft flying. Official supply chains couldn't provide parts fast enough, so ground crews acquired them through unofficial channels. Entire P-38s were cannibalized to keep others airborne. Mechanics stripped crashed aircraft before recovery crews arrived. A thriving underground economy developed where a turbo supercharger might cost a case of whiskey or cartons of cigarettes. Squadron commanders quietly tolerated the black market because official channels failed them. Investigative reports documented systematic parts theft, but prosecuting mechanics would have grounded entire squadrons. The Lightning's complexity made criminals of the men trying to keep it flying. Japanese intelligence reports described the P-38 with a dismissive nickname that revealed their tactical assessment: Futatatsu no Hikoki Hitori no Pairoto. 2 planes, 1 pilot. They recognized it as essentially 2 aircraft joined together, creating twice the systems to fail. Japanese fighter tactics specifically exploited this. They'd damage 1 engine, knowing the asymmetric thrust would force the Lightning to disengage or crash. Captured documents show Japanese pilots were trained to target individual engines rather than the cockpit. They understood that crippling 1 power plant often meant mission-killing the entire aircraft. The nickname wasn't fear or respect. It was recognition of a fundamental vulnerability. 1 bullet in the right place could turn America's twin-engine advantage into a fatal liability. When P-38s were pressed into dive-bombing roles, they proved catastrophically inaccurate. The twin-boom design created unpredictable airflow during dive-bomb runs, making it nearly impossible to aim precisely. Bombs released from underwing racks would tumble erratically through disturbed air between the booms. Accuracy tests showed P-38s hit targets 40% less often than single-engine fighters performing the same mission. Pilots complained that the aircraft wandered during bombing dives in ways they couldn't compensate for. Despite carrying impressive bomb loads, the Lightning wasted ordnance on targets that P-47s or P-51s would have destroyed efficiently. Ground commanders learned to request any fighter except P-38s for close air support requiring precision. Starting P-38 engines in cold weather was mechanical Russian roulette. The Allison V-1710s required precise preheating procedures, but Pacific Island and European forward bases lacked proper equipment. Mechanics resorted to dangerous improvised heating, burning fuel under engines, using blowtorches on oil pans, or running engines to dangerous temperatures before flight. Cold starts caused cylinder head cracks that were irreparable in field conditions. Entire engines were destroyed by impatient pilots who advanced throttles before proper warm-up. Winter operations in Europe saw 30% higher engine replacement rates than summer. The official manual specified 20-minute warm-up procedures that tactical situations rarely allowed. Pilots faced impossible choices: risk engine destruction with quick starts, or let enemies escape while engines warmed. The P-38's high-altitude oxygen system developed leaks that caused severe hypoxia without warning. Pilots would gradually lose consciousness while experiencing vivid hallucinations. Several P-38s were found crashed with pilots still strapped in, having flown unconscious into terrain. The system's complexity, with long oxygen lines running through both booms to the central cockpit, created multiple failure points. Connections loosened from vibration, and fittings cracked from temperature extremes. Pilots reported seeing phantom aircraft, hearing voices, or becoming convinced they were invincible before blacking out. Hypoxia killed pilots in ways that appeared as pilot error. Crash investigations eventually revealed oxygen system failures were far more common than initially recognized. In an astonishing bureaucratic failure, the Army Air Corps officially classified the P-38 as obsolete in March 1941, 9 months before Pearl Harbor. Planning documents recommended phasing it out in favor of newer designs. The assessment concluded its complexity, maintenance requirements, and performance limitations made it unsuitable for modern warfare. Only the sudden, desperate need for long-range fighters after Pearl Harbor saved the program from cancellation. The aircraft that would become legendary for Pacific operations was literally scheduled for termination when the war started. Thousands of P-38s were built and flown only because the military had no alternative when they desperately needed range. The Lightning succeeded despite being officially declared a failure. The P-38 Lightning earned its reputation through survival, not superiority. It succeeded despite catastrophic flaws, impossible maintenance demands, and design compromises that killed pilots. The fork-tailed devil wasn't perfect, it was persistent. Its legacy proves that wars aren't won by flawless machines, but by imperfect aircraft flown by determined crews who refuse to quit. Vintage Plane covers the machines that shaped aerial warfare. Keep watching to discover stories the history books overlooked.